In this segment, we're going to begin our discussion of the Arab world. And the best way I thought I could begin the discussion was to show the concentration of population in that region on the basis of where they're mostly located, because the area is arid. And to do that, I have created my own map, which I'm going to show it in terms of 4 different islands of population. The first one is my inartistic rendition of the Mediterranean Sea. And the first island is what I call the Levant. This is also known as Greater Syria. And to give you some orientation, I'm going to put some of these major cities there. So we have Damascus, Beirut, and Jerusalem there. The second island is in large part Egypt. And I guess you could include Sudan there. And the Nile River is separating the 2 islands. The cities, major cities being Alexandria and Cairo. The third island is in North Africa, the Maghreb. And the Maghreb major cities are also reflected in these cities that I put there: Algiers, Rabat, and Casablanca. And finally, the last island in terms of concentration of population going to be Mesopotamia. Again, remember, this is mostly an arid area, mostly desert. And so the islands really are the concentration of the major population there. We are going to come back to this map later on when I'm going to start my discussion of the transition in the Arab world from pre-mass to mass politics. But before doing this, what I like to do is to kind of go over the lay of the land in the Arab world after the 2001 Arab awakening that we have talked about. And to do so, I would like to point out that I'm going to be relying on the categorization that was made by a very astute observer of Arab politics by the name of Ramri Khoury, who argued that the contemporary Arab world after the year 2011 can be grouped into 4 more or less distinct categories. I have modified his categories and adapted them for the purpose of my lecture, so they don't fully correspond to what he has. But the 4 groupings that Khoury and my adaptation has yielded are the following. The first one represents the states that have succeeded in overthrowing their entrenched dictators. And these are states that are in the throes of creating legitimate representative government. And in some cases, actually, they're simply trying to establish authority after the collapse of the old political system. So what are the countries that fall in this first grouping? Well, the first one was Tunisia, and the second one, Egypt. In terms of the current situation, Islamist parties won parliamentary elections and have drafted a new constitution in both of these countries, and they have also won the presidential election as well. Remember, Tunisia was the country where the Arab uprising originated. Still, though, what is interesting about these 2 countries is that the post-revolution political transition, especially in Egypt, has been highly contested, and in many ways it has resulted in violent clashes. The main conflict in Egypt, and you will see also to a lesser extent, nonetheless important extent in Tunisia, has to do with the intensifying polarization between, on the one hand, the Islamicists, and on the other hand, the secular elements of the society who view the Islamicists having hijacked their revolution. Add to this political conflict the economic downturn that has further exacerbated the political division among the masses. As I said, this kind of a conflict is mirrored to not as intense a degree in Tunisia as well. So the second anniversary of the revolution in Egypt was greeted with a huge protest by the opponents of the Islamicist government. Several dozens were killed, and the new president of Egypt, Mohamed Morsi, being the very first freely elected president of Egypt, has invoked emergency power. And recall that the emergency power was the hallmark of the rule of the former hated dictator of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak. So Morsi, by declaring and relying on that instrument, has really reminded the Egyptians of the old days of dictatorship, and he has imposed a 1 month long emergency rule in 3 of the cities along the Nile littoral, the Port Said in the north, Islamia, and the Suez. The third country in that first category is Libya. You need to remember, though, that the overthrow of the government of Libya, run by Muammar Gaddafi, was accomplished only by violent means, and in fact, it did require outside intervention and support. Remember, NATO's air support was critical in the downfall of Gaddafi. The situation in Libya today remains very chaotic. In fact, in the case of the Libya in this category, the challenge is much more basic. The post-revolutionary government controls only part of the country. This lack of control was well illustrated during the attack on our embassy in Benghazi towards the end of last year. On the anniversary of the September 11, our ambassador Chris Stevens and 3 other Americans were killed by the terrorist group who targeted them, and the government simply was unable to protect them. Finally, the last country in this grouping would be Yemen, and you notice that I did put a question mark in the case of Yemen. Its so-called quote-unquote revolution has been both violent and remains largely an incomplete, or if you like, a work in progress. And that revolution in Yemen actually began shortly after the Tunisian and the Egyptian revolution. After much resistance, its dictator, Ali Abdullah Saleh, finally agreed to transfer power, but only to do so to his vice president, Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi. So Hadi still represents the former regime, although his task is obviously for a major reform and change of the system. Hadi is in charge of supervising the drafting of a new constitution, after which is to be followed up by an election both for the president as well as the parliament in 2014. So the first grouping involves these 4 countries: Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and also Yemen. Now we go to our second grouping. In the second grouping, you get states where popular attempts to overthrow the dictatorship has met with very, very stiff opposition and violent resistance from the ruling regime. In fact, the extent of that resistance and opposition has been such that these countries have either been pushed to the brink of the civil war, or they are potentially there already. Of course, the best and most prominent example of this category would be Syria. In fact, Syria is into the second year of a conflict that is a civil war in all but name. Over 60,000 fatalities as I speak has occurred, and there is no end in sight as to which side will win. The other country that is close and potentially can become is Syria, but of course because of the size of the population is nowhere as large as Syria, is this city-state of Bahrain. It's really an island. It's a close ally of the United States, home of the Fifth Fleet. And in the case of Bahrain, it has avoided a revolution only because of the blatant military intervention by its allies, Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. When things were getting out of hand, the Saudis, and mostly Saudis, sent their tanks and quelled the uprising. So Bahrain is a potential powder keg and would certainly fall in this second groupings. The third grouping is made up of countries that are facing, by various estimates, low to moderate demands on the part of the population for reform. This demand is very much in tune with the widespread, the revolutionary momentum that was generated by the Arab awakening. The candidates in this category are the following. The first one, of course, is Jordan. In the case of Jordan, as soon as the first outcropping of Arab Spring began to manifest itself and there was some protest movement in Jordan, the king decided to be much more proactive than reactive, at least nominally so, and the king initiated some constitutional reforms. He gave up some power. For example, he allowed the parliament rather than the king to choose the prime minister. But having done that, so far the king, Abdullah II, has managed to really outwit his Islamic opponents. Especially this was well reflected in the recent parliamentary elections in which the king's supporter got the majority. So Jordan is one of those countries that the demand for change is there, and it could become more intense if the population feels that the reforms that have been initiated thus far do not go far enough. The second country is the one we left a couple of years ago, and that's Iraq. Since our departure, really there has been a steady, although slow, increase in violence. In fact, the situation has become so polarized in Iraq that the possibility of some kind of a civil war can no longer be ruled out. And the civil war can have a sectarian basis to it. The Sunnis, who are the minority against the Shiite majority, because the Sunnis feel that they have been disenfranchised by the Shiites, just as the Shiites were disenfranchised under Saddam Hussein. And then the other kind of a civil war, instead of being sectarian, may very well have an ethnic war between the Arabs versus the Kurds. There is every indication that the Kurds are very adamant to achieve independence, and their area includes important natural resources and oil fields. So the other possibility of conflict in Iraq is along the line of the ethnic conflict as opposed to sectarian one. The third country in this category would be Lebanon, and there really the focus would be on the role that Hezbollah will be able to play. Hezbollah's power and influence could adversely be affected depending on the outcome of developments in the rest of the Middle East, and that includes obviously the most important country as a neighbor of Lebanon, and that is the Syrian regime of Assad. So if Assad's regime fall, then it would be much more difficult for Iran to be able to help Hezbollah. Therefore, a lot is riding on the whether or not determination, whether or not Assad's regime can survive, and Hezbollah's bargaining will be dramatically affected by the outcome of the situation in Syria. The fourth category would be Palestine, although Palestine is in practical terms not a state, but at least nominally, because of the United Nations vote, you can consider it a state. The stalled peace talks there, together with the fact that Islamist electoral gains have occurred in Egypt, in Tunisia, and in other places, they all seem to have redounded to benefit mostly the Hamas as opposed to the other rival which we support, the Fatah. So the Hamas has actually benefited from the Arab uprising in ways that Fatah, the more secular group, have not. Therefore, it still remains to be seen whether or not the Palestinians can work out their differences and unite, although the division between the Islamist Hamas and the more secular Fatah is still significant and to some almost unbridgeable. So in the case of Palestine, there is demand on the part of the masses for these people either to work their differences because that would strengthen the bargaining position of the Palestinian if they end up to be united, as well as a demand for more representative, more transparent form of government, all of them ushered in by the happenings that we have called the Arab Awakening. The fifth country in this category will be Algeria, and all I need to do in this respect to point out the recent tragic hostage crisis in Amanas, Algeria's gas plant, where Al-Qaeda in Maghreb illustrated the vulnerability of the state. Algeria really had its civil war back in the 1990s when the military decided to prevent the Islamicists who had won the election to take over the control of the government. And that civil war may get reignited depending on what happens in the rest of the Arab world. So you can see everything seems to be intertwined here. And then the last country in this category would be Morocco. King Mohammed VI has also felt the pressure of the need to make reforms and to make concessions and to engage in power sharing. And therefore, he has agreed to some constitutional reforms and power sharing to at least temporarily diffuse the protest movement there. However, the opposition leaders in Morocco contend that the new constitution that the king endorsed is a product of mostly cosmetic changes rather than real political gains, because the king still stays as both the head of the Council of Ministers as well as the Ulama Council. The Ulama Council are the religious council, and they're the one in charge of the mosque. So the king still remains the head of that council as well, just like in Saudi Arabia in a way. And as before, he is selecting prime minister. The only concession he has made is that he will now choose the prime minister from the party that has the majority in the parliament. He also remains the head of the military, the security forces, and the intelligence services. So you can see these changes are not very, very large. and to the population not that meaningful.